So Delphine, it's great to be with you again. As I know, your book, which is going to be published eventually in the United States, Anti-Semites and Jews in the 21st Century, is a bestseller in France. I have two questions about that. Why do you think it has become a bestseller, and how did you come to write it?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for this invitation. I want to say it's a real pleasure to spend this moment with you. I was supposed to be physically in New York, actually, but even though I can't be with you physically, joining you through this screen is a very important moment for me. Important because, as you said, we've known each other for many years, and you were my mentor when I was in rabbinical school, and also joining you through the 92nd Street Y is very meaningful for me because, as I told you, 18 years ago, precisely, I joined a lecture. I was then a tourist in New York, and I came to the 92nd Street Y to join a lecture. And on that day, I decided to join rabbinical school. So being back in the walls of the 92nd Street is actually very meaningful for me. So the book was released in France at the beginning of year 19, so 2019. And on the week it was released, the French government released new statistics. Precisely on the same week, they announced that there was a rise in 74% in the number of anti-Semitic incidents in France, both serious and less serious verbal and physical aggressions. And so it was quite weird, actually, that the book precisely was released the same week, where everybody in the news wanted to understand how this could happen. We were exactly 74 years after the end of the war, and the government was announcing the same terrible number, like 74% in rise in anti-Semitism. And so I think many people, and already for years, have been trying to understand this rise all around the world, actually, again, in anti-Semitism. I feel that I belong to a generation that was convinced that we would not have to experience that. It seems to me that I grew up having the feeling that I belong to a generation that was born too short after the Shoah, and we were somehow convinced that we would be immunized or prevented for experiencing or fighting this war. And it seems to me that something changed for us, for our generation, maybe already in the 1990s, but probably at the beginning of year 2000, that we realized slowly that anti-Semitism was on the rise. No one yet wanted to talk about it. The French Jewish community started to talk about it, and at the beginning people said, well, maybe it's an exaggeration, maybe it's not really a rise in anti-Semitism. And it took many years for the people to be aware of this phenomenon. And I decided that I had to search into our tradition. Actually, that's what my book is trying to do. There were many books written about anti-Semitism from a political point of view, a sociological point of view, and sometimes even a psychoanalytical point of view. But I decided to dive into Jewish sources and rabbinic literature to figure out what our sages and what our tradition has to say about hate of Jews along history. It's not that we have the answer or that the rabbis know exactly what is the cause of anti-Semitism, but they're somehow aware that there are specific conditions in a society or in a group or in a family that enable anti-Semitism to be on the rise. And it seems that it's very relevant for today, because what the rabbis seem to be aware of pretty early in history is quite at stake today in our society. For example, they tell us that each time there is an obsession on the notion of identity, an obsession on notions of purity, authenticity, so you can be pretty sure that Jews will be accused of preventing you from achieving purity and authenticity. And pretty soon they will be the scapegoats of the story, as we know. And we seem to stand exactly there today. So I think that's an explanation of why the book became a bestseller in France here. It was quite weird for me to see that in the subway, in the metro here, and in the buses and the street, people were reading a rabbinic book, with a lot of midrash and rabbinic literature. But this is what happened. And the book now is translated to many, many languages, and hopefully soon to English.
Well, it's a fascinating answer, and of course leads us to so many different questions. But I want to ask one question about you, and I know I'm not on the screen, but it's much better for the audience to just see you if they had to choose between us. You've really emerged as a tremendous leader both in Paris and France, religious leader certainly. And those of us who know you can understand why that's happened. But do you think it says something about changes in France?
Well, I don't know. It's a good question. It seems to me that in the past years, for sure, France has been going through a lot of internal questioning around the role and the place of religion in society. For maybe the American audience, it's not well known, but the French recipe, let's say, of the French Republic, what we could call the Republican promise of France, could be summarized in the following way. The French nation and the French Republic promises each individual that he or she will always be able to speak in the first person singular, but will never be able to speak in the first person plural as a community or as belonging to a community, because the only first person singular in the nation is the nation itself. So France guarantees you as a citizen that you'll be able to express your individuality, your ability to speak in the first person singular, and somehow protects you from any type of pressure that might pose on you your belonging to an ethnicity or a religion. But in recent years, this French traditional and historical recipe has been challenged by the rise in France of what we call communautarism. I have no idea if I can translate it in English to communautarism. It wouldn't mean anything, I think, in English. It's the idea that in France, slowly in recent years, more and more people have developed a tendency, when they speak, even in the first person singular, they speak about their community. They speak as a Jew, as a Muslim, as a member of the LGBT community, as a woman, and it's something that totally counters what has been along centuries the promise of French laïcité, secularism. And I feel that this requested from maybe the French nation to change its approach to religious voices. And it's true that I feel in recent years that people like me, I'm not the only one, like other religious leaders in France, have been invited to take part differently in the national debate. I could point to one moment that has been probably a life-changing experience for me, and actually I think it summarizes your question. In January 2015, the Charlie Hebdo journal was attacked in this terror attack where many people died at the Charlie Hebdo newspaper, the magazine. And one of the women killed there, actually the only woman that was killed on that day at Charlie Hebdo, her name was Elsa Kayat, and her family asked me to lead the funeral. And I found myself, and I will never forget this moment that was, I think, not only for me, but for the nation, like a change in history. I think I was standing at the cemetery in Paris, and the Jewish community, it was immediately after also the Hyper Cacher attack, and I was leading this ceremony, and the Charlie Hebdo team was there and the Jewish community was there, and it felt that in a very interesting manner we were connecting on that day and trying to shape what would be new alliances in the new world and the unknown world that was just opening in front of us. I remember it was quite actually a funny moment, if someone can laugh on that day, that the family of Elsa Kayat asked me to come close. Elsa Kayat was culturally very Jewish, but her family is quite anti-religious in her way. She was working at Charlie Hebdo, and in a way she developed a kind of very anti-religious rhetoric. And they brought me close to the family, and the sister of Elsa Kayat said to the other guests, or the other people who were attending the funeral, she said, "She's the rabbi, but don't worry, she's a secular rabbi." And I was like totally in shock with her, and I could understand what she meant, that somehow there was not only room, but there was a request at this time for other type of religious discourse that people were not used to hear, And I feel that today progressive voices of our religious traditions are heard differently in France and Europe than they used to be.
Well, you actually did write a book with a liberal Islam leader talking about that. Has that cut across other divides in France, the racial divide, for instance, which of course now is a topic of great discussion here in the United States?
Yeah, so I wrote a book with Rachid Benzine, who is an Islamologist. He comes from Morocco, and we are very good friends. Anyway, we decided to write a book because I think both of us reached the same conclusions in recent years and experienced a weird transformation that it seems that in recent years we became somehow only Jews or Muslims. I'm going to try to explain what I mean by that. I don't count the number of times that during an interview here in France in recent years, I need to explain that I'm not only Jewish, And one of the effects of this communautarism that was strengthened in France in recent years, I think the situation is totally different in America, because obviously you have a very different history of relationship to identities and to religious identities. But for France, it's a new phenomenon that in recent years, I constantly had to explain to people that I'm Jewish, but I'm also a woman who experienced living abroad and who has children, but who lived outside of France for a few years. I'm trying to complexify my discourse to enable the discussion not simply to enclose me into one element of my identity, because I feel that we are somehow sick, beyond sick. We are like threatened by this tendency to unlock people into just a very impoverished definition of themselves, So I feel that what I'm trying to do, and I've been trying to do for years now in my conversations with other religious leaders, is to reconnect to complex definitions of ourselves that are the only thing that can enable us to continue talking to each other. And, I think it has everything to do with the rise in anti-Semitism. I'm convinced that anti-Semitism always goes hand in hand with the refusal of dealing with complexity. When a society wants to simplify everything in the background, when you want to perceive people as being right or wrong, black or white, when you get rid of complexity of belongings. So I think there is a threat of anti-Semitism in the background. And I think the social media, Twitter, Facebook, and other, doesn't help us on that matter. There is a tendency in our society to simplify the debate instead of complexifying it. And I think Jewish tradition can truly help us in that matter. We've always been, a long history, very good at complexifying. We always say that when you ask a Jew one question, he will give you at least 5 different answers. I think our tradition is a tradition that really cherishes complexity and subtlety. And I think we desperately need this in our personal definitions today and in our national and collective definitions.
Yeah, is this unique to Jews? In other words, this complexity that we are both us and them. right? That we're always straddling at least two worlds, if not many more. Is this something that's born out of our history? And if you could just give some examples, because you did, I think, in the book, some examples of how that complexity was born into our very being, into the core of who we are.
Yes. Yeah, I think we could give 1,000 examples from the Jewish literature. I could give, for example, now a first one. I dive in the book a lot into the book of Esther. The book of Esther is probably the biblical book that speaks the most about anti-Semitism. Of course, the word doesn't appear because it's a very modern concept. But the hate of Jews is really central in the book of Esther through the character of Haman, who represents the hater of Jews. And what is interesting is that in the very first line of the book, we hear what is the reproach that Haman has toward the Jews. And he basically says, there is in the kingdom a people who is like us, but not like us. They follow our rules, but also their own rules. And this accusation is actually a permanent and very central accusation in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic accusation along history. We have always accused Jews of being both the same and the other. We hate the Jews when they're different, but we actually even hate them more when they're just like us. We can't stand that they stay aside, but actually it's even more bothering when maybe your neighbor is a Jew or your president, and maybe you don't know that your physician is a Jew. The idea that the Jew is both very visible but invisible, just like you but different from you, is something that is special in the anti-Semitic discourse. It's different from the racist or the typical racist discourse. Racism is about being threatened by otherness, by pure otherness. But anti-Semitism is a threat that people perceived when they're threatened both that someone would like them and not like them. What is interesting is that in Jewish tradition, there seems to be a very strong awareness that we are who we are because we owe something to otherness. We keep repeating it constantly in the Jewish calendar, in the Jewish sacred narratives, that we were born in Egypt, that we came out of Ur, through the story of Abram. And actually, we are who we are because we are aware that our origin is not pure, that actually we had to take a journey and to keep in memory the foreignness that exists in us from the beginning. For example, the Jewish calendar counts the name of the months are Babylonian months. When we celebrate Passover, we use Roman symposium symbols. It seems that Judaism is obsessed with the idea that our identity is an ability to deal with meeting the other and integrating elements of otherness into our identity. So to say it differently, I would say that in Judaism, we keep teaching that you are who you are, because at the core of who you are, there is something that is not you. So
it's interesting because another example of that is the name of our primary institution, synagogue, comes from the Greek word. So, but one of the other things, and I'm thinking as you talk about what a challenge that is to the nationalist, right? To the one who says we need purity of our people, whether the folk in Germany or whatever, that this is a time when we have to draw back behind our own national ghetto walls, and let's keep that purity of spirit and blood alive. And therefore, Jews don't really have a place in that, do they?
Yeah, I think you're really touching, for me, the core of the hate against Jews. I mean, each time a society becomes, sometimes it's a society, sometimes it's an individual, sometimes it's a tribe or a family or a group. But the moment this group or this person becomes obsessed with purity and authenticity, so this is the slippery slope. Because actually very, very fast, the Jew And it doesn't matter if the Jew is around, or sometimes, there is anti-Semitism even when there are no Jews around. But the Jew becomes the name of what prevents you from reaching this purity. And it has been present in the anti-Semitic rhetorics all along history. Obviously, it was present in the Middle Age when Jews were accused of bringing disease and polluting and poisoning the wells. It was present, obviously, in the Nazi Germany when Jews were accused of being a polluting agent. But it was also present more recently. Obviously, you remember in Pittsburgh, almost 2 years ago, when the guy stepped into the synagogue to kill worshippers, and we tried to understand what was his motive, and he said that he was accusing the Jews to letting caravans of migrants pollute the soil of the United States. So this rhetorics of pollution and contamination was always at stake, and the Jews have always been associating with kind of what I would call the porosity of frontiers. They're accused of making the frontiers of your spirit, of your society, of your body more porous, and preventing you from being truly, firmly yourself. And I think we should really be aware of this in the period we're experiencing now, as we are going through a pandemic, because undoubtedly this rhetorics of purity and this fear of contamination, as we know, will probably get an anti-Semitic translation somehow.
Yeah, which in fact translates very easily into the theories that, anti-Jewish and Semitic theories, that we're the ones who are responsible for the pandemic, right? That we are the contaminants.
Yeah. Yeah, or either we are the contaminant, and somehow we are managing to gain something of this pandemia, because obviously Jews are always accused of being in a situation of manipulation. If you look, and it's pretty interesting, even though I'm not sure, if you don't want to have nightmares, I'm not sure it's a good idea, but if you look at anti-Semitic caricature along history, obviously the Jews are represented with their nose and their ears, but on all pictures, you see drawings of very long ends, because the Jews are always accused of being in a situation of domination and therefore of manipulation of the world. They control either themselves, or they control the controlling powers of the world, which enables you to get rid of any responsibility. I think it's very common. Anti-Semitism is very common, actually, because if you want to get rid of any
we're going to benefit from these tragedies somehow. There's a benefit to us. I mean, one of the I think paradoxes is and that you point out, is the accusation that Jews have everything which the hater aspires to have, and on the other hand, we're perceived as being less than men. I mean, and I use men not in the generic humanity, but less than men, because I think one of your chapters is about this whole issue of anti-Semitism and sex, right? Gender, and how we're perceived.
Yeah, in the book I researched a lot this question of the link between misogyny and anti-Semitism. Actually, all along history, Jews and women have been accused pretty much of the same things. Like, Jews and women are accused to be hysterical, and people think they love money and they love to be close to powerful people, and they're not reliable, etc., etc. This rhetoric is common to both hates, women and Jews. And again, it's not surprising, because I think femininity and Jewishness both represent openness to otherness, like the idea that it has something to do with another who is both like you but different from you, and has something to do with your origin and who you are. But it's true. The other point that I'm raising in the book that you just mentioned is the fact that, in a very interesting and paradoxical manner, Jews are always accused of being both more and less. They've been accused of things, of contrary things, simultaneously along history. You know, Jews have been accused of being too rich and too poor, of leading society or being parasites of the society. They've been accused of, benefiting from the system or owning the system. They've been accused of being Bolshevik and capitalist, and they've been accused of being patriarchal or too feminist, and you can accuse them of both things simultaneously, of being less and more. And it's actually an interesting difference, again, between racism and anti-Semitism. Because I think very often racism is based on the idea that the other is below you. The idea that your civilization or your color of skin or your accent or whatever makes you, like someone more civilized or someone who stands above the other. Whereas anti-Semitism is often built on the opposite, on the idea that the Jew stands above you and holds a position in society that should have been yours, owns the money that should have been yours, or has something that you deserved but didn't get because he somehow usurped, you can say in English, usurpated, I don't know, like he stole something that was supposed to be yours. So in a way, racism is like a complex of superiority, whereas sometimes anti-Semitism is like a jealousy, an envy, and sometimes even a complex of inferiority that invites you to, allow you not to deal with your failure, with it's kind of a way to put aside your existential questioning and suppose that someone else is responsible for your failure and for what you may be missing.
Yeah, and I think indirectly, you're actually touching on something that is happening, just beginning to happen in the protests here in the United States, which is anti-Semitic signs showing up among the protesters. And I wonder if that's happening at all in France.
So actually, there was exactly this discussion in the past 48 hours in France. There was a big Black Lives Matters demonstration in Paris 2 days ago. And in the protest, at a certain moment, the extreme right, members of a group of extreme right activists showed up, and there was and attacked and provoked the activists. And there was a counterattack filled with anti-Semitism, which was an absolute, like the summon of the nonsense. Like you had people from the extreme left screaming at extreme right anti-Semitic activists, dirty Jews. So and so there were a lot of course it was those were very isolated voice, and they do not, and it's important to say that those voices, minority voices, in any way do not represent the movement and the core of these demonstrations against racism. But I think it teaches us something very important that we need to be vigilant and to pay attention to. It seems to me that and I remember it clearly, actually, in the years, the 80s and the 90s, the fight against racism and anti-Semitism was a common fight. There was no way we were able to disconnect these fights. And something happened that actually I'm not able to point and to date precisely, but it seems today that many actors and activists in those fights seem not to fight the same war today. You suddenly find a lot of people who believe that the war against racism is their war, but not the war against anti-Semitism, and vice versa. And I think it's a huge, huge mistake that we're going to pay very heavy price for that, because I think there's no way we can disconnect these fights. We must be able to identify differences sometimes between racism and anti-Semitism, but I think there is no way we will be able to fight these terrible disease of our society if we don't fight this war side by side.
Yeah, in fact, it may even be worse than that, because if the fight is against racism is really the fight against white supremacy, and Jews are perceived as being part of that cadre of white supremacists, the fight against racism is also a fight against Jews.
Yeah, because again, we go back to the idea that the Jews are supposedly owning something that they shouldn't own. And sometimes this idea of a privilege resonates with elements that unfortunately echo some anti-Semitic traditional rhetorics, these supposition that Jews are somehow holding a privilege that they stole from someone. So we should really be careful with this language. It all goes back to the question. For me, it all goes back to the question of language. It seems to me in recent years in France, I became, just like many of my friends, I became very sensitive to what I would call anti-Semitic language. And sometimes this anti-Semitic language is not spoken by anti-Semites. And this is where we should be careful, Sometimes people who really would not define themselves as anti-Semite, and I even think they've been struggling against it for all their life. Sometimes the elements of anti-Semitic discourse, finding a scapegoat and accusing someone else of having power or control over your life, suddenly it's as if, the anti-Semitic language was a ghost that was somehow haunting the society we live in. I don't know. I'm in the past, I'd say even weeks or months. I'm obsessed with this question of ghosts.
When you come back and visit, we'll explore that more. But I want to move on to just one other issue because our time is sadly growing too short. One of the things that you say in the manuscript that I read is that the tropes, and I'm paraphrasing, the tropes of anti-Israel harken back to the themes of traditional anti-Semitism, and that Israel is an obstacle to historical wholeness. Can you kind of create an equation between anti-Zionism or anti-Israel and anti-Semitism based on your theories and research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very complex question. It's here a very complex and touchy question, and I know it is also in the States. I've been asked so many times in recent years to comment the question: is anti-Zionism always anti-Semitism? And I think it's much more complex than that. When people tell me today that they're anti-Zionist, and I do meet a lot of people who tell me they're anti-Zionist, I immediately stop the conversation and I ask them, what do you mean? And my experience teaches me that unfortunately most of the time people are just totally unable to explain what they mean by that. I mean, when you say you're an anti-Zionist, do you mean that Israel has no right to exist? Or do you mean that you are strongly and harshly criticizing today's policy in Israel? Most of the time, anti-Zionism became a kind of gimmick that prevents people from, we were talking before about the need for complexity. So this is exactly at stake in this debate. Most of the time, you have no complexity in the ability to define what anti-Zionism is. I have no doubt that very often it serves as a way to hide an anti-Semitism that has stopped being kosher, thanks God. When you cannot say you're anti-Semite, for some people, anti-Zionism is like a key word not to use an embarrassing, to avoid an embarrassing statement. But I think it could express something else. Just I simply don't understand why people need to invent a term for that. If what you mean by anti-Zionism is the need to criticize Israel's policy, so then say it. But why would you need to invent a new term for that? If I want to criticize Trump's policy today or another leader's policy in the world, would I need to invent a term for that? I'm not sure. So I think, again, it goes back to a question of language. How do we manipulate language? And what kind of ghosts and spirits are present in the words we're using, sometimes as we are aware of that and sometimes not being aware of that.
Yeah, it used to be that there was a sharp division between the policies of the government of Israel and the people of Israel. And there was a sharp division between the Israel and Jews worldwide. Those boundaries, those borders have been obliterated. So in fact, what happens is the policies of Israel equates with Jews worldwide, which is in certain ways why we're put on the spot and trying to explain things with which we don't agree. But I want to move on to a question that's come from our listeners or our viewers. And one is that, you have really made an argument through that anti-Semitism can be seen through the roots of our tradition. And the question is there a prescription offered in these traditional sources? And how would we apply today to combat that or to rid the world of that?
Well, I think what the rabbis mainly teach us is not a recipe against anti-Semitism. I'm sorry about that. I would have loved to tell you on page this or that of the Talmud, we have the final recipe against hate of the Jews. It's not there. But what the rabbis teach us is that we should be able to identify a specific context in history that will promote anti-Semitism. As I said, the rabbis are really aware that this obsession around authenticity, purity, identity, and closed identity are the perfect medium to enable the hate of the Jews. So they enable us to identify those moments. And I think also what they give us, and it's very precious, I think, and I experience it on a daily basis, is that Jewish tradition gives us keys of resilience. Like it teaches us that even though anti-Semitism will probably not disappear, that we are still around. And there is a possibility for Jews to stand out of the tragedy and never to let their history be told as a tragedy. The capacity of staying true actors and not victims of what happens to you. This ability to tell your own story, even sometimes through Jewish humor, the ability to laugh at ourselves, like self-derision and self-criticism, is a very, very powerful key to remain, in charge of your own life, to feel that you're still an actor and in responsibility for what might be. And I think it's a powerful tool for us, Jews, obviously, as a key of resilience, but I think it's also a very powerful tool for the world today. And maybe we need to say a word about that. I think we live in a time of competition, of victimhood. Very often people, today we feel that a lot of people love to tell their own story through the lens of the pain that happened to them or their ancestors. And it's okay to be aware and to share and to speak about your pain and the pain of your history. But you should always make sure that this tragedy doesn't define you. And it's not the core of who you are. It happened to you, but it doesn't say who you are, because you can always be beyond what happened to you. And I think it's a very powerful teaching that Jews can teach the world, actually. And I think we desperately all need today to hear narratives of resilience wherever they come from.
And in that regard, a question's been asked, and pointing out that many Jews have left France for Israel, and the question is, when do things get bad enough, right? That Jews will know that they have to leave. Do you think it will happen? And I would frame it in a positive way. Frame the question in a positive way. What can we learn from France in terms of the ability to address these issues? France has had great thinkers and writers and tremendous culture. Are there messages that can come from French culture and literature and philosophy that will help us rid the world, or rid at least France, of this? And how will Jews know if it is necessary to leave? Many Germans miss that mark.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question has been asked many times in recent years. Many people asked us, especially Jewish leaders in France, are you going to stay? Are you going to leave? And I often felt that this question was more than problematic, because what I wanted to hear from people, especially from my fellow citizens here in France, was not when are you going to leave? What's the brand of your suitcase? But more, what are we going to do together to make sure that our children are protected, all our children? So to answer your question, I think that France is a good example of what complex relationships Jews can have to the country they inhabit. French Jewish history is made of the brightest light and the darkest, like the deepest darkness that you can imagine. France is the country that emancipated the Jews, the first country that emancipated the Jews. And France is the country of the Dreyfus Affair. France is the country of Vichy, the Vichy government. But France is also the first country that had Léon Blum, a Jewish leader, at the head of the state. So you can actually give arguments in both directions that France and French Jews have a history of confidence and defiance, of believing and despair and hope intertwined with each other. And actually I can testify of this because I come from a very long family of French Jews that has been in love with the French Republic for centuries and deeply attached to this country, but at the same time, very aware of its dark sides and the dark moments of its history. And I think if it's true in France, it's true all over the world. I think Jews are really aware, even when they feel very comfortable where they are. I think there is always a feeling that something could change. And actually, there could always pop up in society someone who tells you that even though you think you belong, maybe you don't belong. Even though you think you're an insider, something could make out of you a kind of outsider or an unwanted presence. And I think most of the Jews in the world are aware of this complexity. So to answer your question, when do Jews need to know that it's time to leave? I think there's something very important to know about French Jews today, and it's actually, those were the words of the French ambassador we heard before. It seems to me that today the government and the French Republic and the public power is fighting this war. It doesn't mean that it's always a fight made of success, but I think it's very, very critical for the Jews, and it has always been, to feel somehow that the power in charge, the public power, is fighting on their side. And that's the main difference between what we experience now and what German Jews experienced in the 30s. I mean, the moment the leaders, politicians, governments are not on your side, so then it might be hopeless. But as long as we can fight this war side by side, as long as we don't feel that we are alone in this war, there is still hope, because as was said before, actually, we all know that anti-Semitism in a society always tells you something about the health of this society, or the lack of health of this society. Jews are always struck first, and then generally the violence will touch everyone.
So a question's been asked, and I'm going to apologize to those who have asked questions. We may not get to all of them today, which kind of gives us a door into doing this again. But what do you think about Macron's decision to legislate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? Is that helpful or not?
I think it was not exactly formulated in this way. I think what Macron said, he accepted this definition that, and I think it's a good thing that actually sometimes anti-Zionism serves as a way to hide anti-Semitism, but I don't think he precisely equated the two terms. And I don't think it's useful to equate precisely the two terms as if they meant exactly the same thing. I think for some people, they don't mean the same thing. But I do think we immediately have to stop the conversation with someone who tells you he's anti-Zionist and to ask him to clarify precisely what he means. Because it's totally legitimate to criticize Israel. I deeply believe it's legitimate to criticize Israel, but I don't think it is to question its right of existence.
Yeah, but by the way, oftentimes when I hear somebody say they're anti-Zionist, the next sentence is, but some of my best friends are Jewish, right? Yeah. In other words, to prove I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm just an anti-Israel because you Jews don't have a right to that land.
Yeah. Another interesting thing is that you have today in the world some people who tell you they're not anti-Semite because they love specific types of Jews. You know, some people tell you, I love Jews when they are nationalist or Zionist, or I love Jews when they are from the left, or I love, and loving a certain type of Jews is always suspicious,
Yeah, we started a little late, so we're going to go a little over the announced time of this ending. Besides, I'm having too much fun. So, in a certain way, when you were talking about Jewish identity, you gave us a positive spin for what I would call, what some of us call Jewish neurosis. In other words, complexity. In which we have the absolute ability to have conversations with ourselves. And it's not ourselves as other Jews, ourselves as individuals. We can have, sometimes the most interesting conversations with ourselves. But you say that, and this is really, I think it's towards the end of the manuscript, so I'm giving a hint for everybody to buy the book when it comes out. You say there's only one way to get rid of Jews. All you have to do is to convince Jews they know exactly what Jewishness is. And by the time you've done that, there won't be any left. You can extrapolate, tell us what, send us off, not that we're finished, but send us off with an understanding of that.
Yeah, because I know, as I said, I think a lot of people are obsessed with their identity, where it comes from, what's the core of their identity. And I think what enabled Judaism to stay alive is the fact that along history, Jews were never able to define what's the core of their Jewishness. We can talk about it in a rabbinic conversation. If you ask rabbis, what makes you a Jew? Some Orthodox rabbi will tell you if you have a Jewish mother or if you convert to Judaism, you're a Jew. But as you know, and as we all know, there are other definitions. Some people will tell you I'm Jewish because I love to tell jokes, because I have a special relationship to Israel, because I speak Hebrew, because my time is Jewish, because I practice, because I believe. We can go. We would never end this conversation. What it means to be a Jew and what's the core of this definition. But this inability to give a definition of Jewishness actually prevented Judaism to give a definition of what it is. If you lack a definition, so then you can infinitely transform who you are. And actually, Jews have a very special talent for experiencing the unending identity. Basically, the next Jew will tell you and will tell us what it means to be a Jew. And as long as the last Jew doesn't appear, we will not know what it means finally to be Jewish. And this possibility of unending definition and interpretation actually is what allowed Judaism to remain alive. And today, I'm very suspicious, even in the Jewish community, when people are so convinced that they know what's the end or the goal of pure or authentic Judaism. I would even say, and it would be a criticism against certain types of Zionists now, sometimes people tell you that their Zionism is is the end of their Judaism in a way. And I think it's a mistake. I think Judaism was never able to define precisely and finally what it is and what it will be for the next ones. And I think we are somehow saved by that. It's something that bothers dearly the anti-Semites. They can't stand the fact that Jews can never define on what relies their identity. But I think it's a very treasured element of who we are. We're always on a journey, just like Abraham. 18 years ago, maybe that would be a nice conclusion. 18 years ago, when I was at the 92nd Street Y, I was listening to Rabbi Norman Cohen teaching that day. It was in November 2002. He was teaching about Abraham's Lech Lecha. And I was standing in the room there at the 92nd Street Y. And on that day, I felt that my Lech Lecha was taking me to rabbinical school. And actually, I feel that in my rabbinate, I just keep teaching about this moment. I keep giving maybe the same sermon, teaching that actually we have never said our last word. And we're always in this journey, making sure that the promised land is ahead of us. And you know what? I really feel that anti-Semitism is a refusal of this, infinite possibility of being that Jews represent.
Well, of all the good things that Norman Cohen does, I'm going to explain to him that you're among the very top of the list. But I know you wanted to think of that as the end, but I have one last question, which I think will help kind of pull it together. Your child comes to you and ready to become bar mitzvah and says, "Mommy, why be Jewish?" What would you say?
Well, it somehow happened to me. My son became a bar mitzvah last year, and it was a tough journey. Just like maybe many children of rabbis, he didn't understand exactly.
All children of rabbis.
Yes. And actually, I think the answer is that Judaism desperately needs his way of saying what it means to be a Jew. That actually, Judaism cherishes incredibly what we've been receiving, but more than what we've been receiving, we cherish the way the new generation will reinterpret this for us. It's the amazing equilibrium between transmission from above and the capacity to learn from what we give, who we give birth to. I often tell my children that the moment they were born, we gave them a name, and giving a name in Judaism, naming a baby, is saying, for example, if it's a boy, you say, my son is Samuel. So is Samuel ben Pnina, Delphine, Pnina is my Hebrew word. But when you say that my son is Samuel ben Pnina, in Hebrew, you actually said something very interesting. Ben in Hebrew means son of, but it also means builder of. Boneh means to build in Hebrew. So actually you say that your children, Samuel, is a builder of his mother. And I think it's a very powerful statement. You give an identity to someone, but at the minute you name that new person in the world, you tell him, you know what? You're going to build the world that gave birth to you. You're going to be the builder. And I think Judaism is a lesson we give to our children constantly. We tell them that actually this tradition means something if they make something out of what we offer them.
So, Delphine, you are a gift to the Jews of France because you're helping them build their community. You're, I think, a gift to the entire nation of France, and you're certainly a gift to the Jews worldwide. And for all those reasons, Not only did I love being with you today, but I have an open invitation for you to come to the 92nd Street Y when you're ever in the United States. On behalf of all of us, we wish you a great deal of mazal. Look forward to reading your book, and thank you on behalf of the World Jewish Congress, the government of France, and the 92nd Street Y. Lech Lecha. Let's all go on together.
Thank you so much for your invitation. Hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Great.
For inviting me.
Bye-bye.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.